Let's look now at topic 4 in our textbook, which deals with how biodiversity is created through heredity or patterns of inheritance in our DNA, chromosomes, and specifically the genes. How are traits passed on? Well, one way traits are passed on is, of course, through offspring in sexual reproduction. And we know that sexual reproduction is much better than asexual when it comes to improving biodiversity. And so let's talk about that for a minute. How do offspring inherit traits from their parents? Because you come from two parents, each parent will provide half of your genes for a trait. So let's go back and let's talk about our gametes. There are sperm and an egg. Sperm have half chromosomes, 23, and and sperm have 23, and when they fertilize, you get a cell with 46 chromosomes in it. And so here's how that works. Let's take a trait like earlobes. Your earlobes can come in one of two forms. They can be unattached from the skin here, or they can be attached. And our chromosomes, we get one from our father, and we get one from our mother. And somewhere along a chromosome, which is coiled up DNA, there might be a spot for a gene. And each chromosome has homologous pairs. But it's what happens to here and here on this that govern what trait will be for your ears or some other physical characteristic. So we call these alleles. Okay? And you get an allele from your mom and a dad and an allele from your mom. So let's talk about scenarios. When both of the alleles you get from your parents tell your body the same thing, then your body expresses that gene. For example, let's say your mom had attached ears and your father had attached ears. What would your ears look like? Well, of course, they would be attached. And what if you got the following alleles from your parents? What will your ears look like? Unattached, unattached, then of course your earlobe will also be unattached. However, maybe you don't get both alleles. If you get one allele for attached from your mom and one free from your dad, so this is your mom, her ear is attached, and this is your dad, his is unattached. What kind of earlobe would you end up with? Well, one of the earlobe alleles dominates over another in most cases. For many traits in the human body that are one or the other, then one will mask or dominate the other trait or allele, no matter if the genes came from your mother or your father. So in the case of earlobes, unattached or free to flop is the dominant. So if you get one of each allele, what kind of ears would you get? So let's say this was your mother's ears and this was your father's. What would your earlobes be? You would have the dominant allele, which is the unattached, and in this case, the one that came from your mom. So there it is. The only way you could end up with the recessive type of ear is if you got the allele from both parents. So if you have attached earlobes, the recessive trait, both parents must have had those alleles. Okay, if parents-to-be both have free to flop or unattached, is there any chance they could have a baby with the recessive trait, which is the attached? Yes, there is actually. Let's talk about this. We use Punnett squares to represent how the possibility is of offspring having certain traits. So here's your mom. Her alleles might be capital E, which represents the dominant, that's unattached, and small e, which represents the recessive. And here are your fathers. Now, attached, unattached. A Punnett square allows us to combine the letters, this letter here, so that one child, there's a chance that one child will be dominant for both. And then this letter here and this letter down here. One parent would be what we call, or one child could be heterozygous, capital E, small e, heterozygous, or a hybrid. This is a hybrid allele. Another one would be capital E, small e, hybrid, and the fourth child might be small e, and that means small e would be attached ears. That's the recessive trait. So if the father and the mother here had 4 children, there's a chance that one of them could have the recessive trait, even though the parents don't have it. Okay, again, these are all just probabilities. Okay, in the end, they could have 5 or 6 kids, and none of them end up with the recessive trait. Okay, it's kind of like flipping a coin. Probability of you getting heads is 50%, but you could flip a coin 5 times and still only get tails. So Punnett squares help us decide how this might work. Let's talk more about traits. Some traits are discrete. That means there's a limited possibility. Being able to roll your tongue, your thumb shape, our blood type, our earlobes, these are discrete traits. However, some are continuous, which means there's a whole range of possibilities. Your height, your weight, your hair color. Also, some traits are inherited and passed on. We call that nature. However, some traits have nothing to do with genetics, and they're not inherited. Those traits are based on what we call our environment and how we're brought up. And so identical twins are a good study because we can watch identical twins grow up and see, of course, genetically they'll look the same and therefore they'll have the same inherited traits, but we can see what's different about them, and we call those their non-inherited traits. One more quick review about Punnett squares. Let's look at the brain pop clip before we wrap this one up.
Dear Tim and Moby, my parents are both short, but I'm 5 feet 8 inches tall, and I'm only 13. What's going on? From Tyra. I bet there are some tall people somewhere in your family tree. We inherit our looks, height, size, and chemical makeup from our parents. That passing of traits from parents to offspring is known as heredity. But remember that parents inherit traits from their parents and so on as far back as your family tree can go. Let's look at some pea plants to see how it all works. Yes, pea plants. Every living thing inherits traits. Back in the 1800s, a monk named Gregor Mendel used pea plants to study how traits like height, color, and shape are inherited. When Mendel crossed short plants with tall plants, he noticed that only tall plants were produced. Whatever produced those short plants seemed to disappear. Mendel called that height trait the dominant factor because it dominated or covered up the short height form. He called the short height trait the recessive factor. By the second generation of pea plants, those recessive short plant forms cropped up again. After tons of research, Mendel was able to predict that 1 out of every 4 pea plants would be short. Now each plant has 2 genes that determine height. The tall gene, represented here by a capital T, is dominant, which means it only takes 1 of these genes to make a plant tall. It takes two short genes, represented by a lowercase t, to make a plant short. In the 19th century, a British geneticist named Reginald Punnett also experimented with peas and developed something called the Punnett square. Among other things, this Punnett square lets you predict what you would get if you crossed a tall plant with a short plant. An offspring gets one gene from each parent, either a tall gene or a short gene. Plants produced by these two plants will be tall because each one has one of these dominant tall genes. But what happens if two of these new plants produce offspring? Now, there are lots of ways this could turn out, but the most likely result is that we get 3 tall plants and 1 short one. Mendel only figured this stuff out after carefully studying 30,000 individual pea plants over an 8-year period. Well, I guess it's pretty reasonable to assume that he had peas for dinner every night.